1961. If you were alive then, you remember the headlines. America's sweetheart divorces playwright. But what the newspapers didn't tell you was where Marilyn Monroe went after the cameras stopped flashing. Arthur Miller's intellectual haven had crumbled, and suddenly Hollywood's most photographed woman had nowhere to hide. Frank Sinatra, the man who owned Palm Springs, who could make or break careers with a single phone call, who moved between the White House and the underworld with equal ease, opened his doors. What seemed like an act of friendship would become something far more complicated, far more dangerous. Behind the gates of Sinatra's mid-century modern fortress, Marilyn wasn't just seeking shelter, she was entering a world where loyalty had a price, where protection came with strings, and where the line between savior and captor would blur beyond recognition. The Hollywood press called it a temporary arrangement between friends. FBI agents watching the house called it something else entirely. And Marilyn, standing in Sinatra's living room with her suitcases and her secrets, had no idea that this refuge would become another cage, one that would tighten around her until her final breath in August 1962. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of Hollywood's golden age, the secrets that shaped legends, and the truth behind the carefully constructed myths. Now let's step inside Frank Sinatra's world, where Marilyn Monroe would spend some of the darkest months of her life. The marriage between Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller had been sold to America as the ultimate fairy tale. Beauty meets brains, Hollywood glamour embraces intellectual sophistication. But by late 1960, that fairy tale had curdled into something bitter and broken. Miller had used their marriage as raw material for his work, transforming Marilyn's vulnerabilities into the character of Rosalind in The Misfits, exposing her struggles with addiction and self-doubt to the world under the guise of art. On set in the Nevada desert during that hellish summer of 1960, Marilyn had discovered pages of Miller's diary where he expressed disappointment in her, described her as exhausting, admitted he no longer felt the way he once had. The betrayal cut deeper than any tabloid scandal ever could. When Miller filed for divorce in Mexico on January 20, 1961, something fundamental broke inside her. In early February, she checked herself into the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York, hoping for help, but finding something closer to imprisonment. The hospital treated her not as a patient seeking care, but as a potentially dangerous case, requiring restraint. She was placed in a locked ward, her belongings taken behind barred windows. She called Joe DiMaggio in desperation, and he secured her release after 3 days, but the damage was done. Marilyn returned to Los Angeles in late February, hollow-eyed and haunted, no longer sure who she could trust. And that's when Frank Sinatra made his move. Frank Sinatra in 1961 was at the absolute peak of his power. He had climbed back from career oblivion in the 1950s to become not just a singer, but a cultural force. The leader of the Rat Pack, a confidant of President Kennedy, a bridge between Hollywood glamour and underworld power. His Vegas shows were command performances where politicians, mobsters, and movie stars mingled freely. When he heard about Marilyn's breakdown, about her return to Los Angeles with nowhere to go, he saw an opportunity disguised as gallantry. He called her, extended the invitation to stay at his homes, framed it as a friendly gesture. Marilyn, still reeling from Miller's betrayal and the Payne Whitney trauma, heard something different in that invitation. Safety, power, protection from a man who seemed invincible. She accepted. Sinatra's Palm Springs compound was legendary. Built in 1947 and renovated throughout the 1950s, the house embodied mid-century modern cool, clean lines, walls of glass opening onto the desert, a pool that reflected the mountains, and a piano where Sinatra had entertained everyone from JFK to Sam Giancana. When Marilyn arrived in early March 1961, carrying her small collection of suitcases and her large collection of prescription bottles, she must have felt like she was entering a sanctuary. The staff treated her with respect. Sinatra was attentive and charming. For the first time in months, Marilyn felt like she could breathe. But she didn't yet understand the nature of Sinatra's world, didn't yet grasp that every kindness in Frank's universe came with invisible strings attached, didn't yet realize that the moment she accepted his hospitality, she had entered into an unspoken contract where the terms would always favor the house. The first few weeks at Sinatra's compound felt like healing. Marilyn slept late, lounged by the pool, avoided the phone calls from her agent. Sinatra was often away, performing in Vegas, recording in Los Angeles, but when he was present, he made Marilyn feel seen and valued. He listened to her talk about the Miller marriage without judgment. He made her laugh with Rat Pack stories and industry gossip. Here was a man who didn't need anything from her, who seemed to want nothing more than to help a friend in crisis. It felt safe. It felt genuine. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamics began to shift. Sinatra's invitations became expectations. His suggestions became instructions. When Marilyn mentioned returning to her own place in Los Angeles, Frank would find reasons why that was a bad idea. The press was camped outside. She wasn't ready. She needed more time to recover. When she talked about accepting a new film role, Sinatra would counsel patience, remind her that she was still fragile. His concern seemed genuine, but it had the effect of keeping Marilyn stationary, dependent, isolated from her own support system. She moved between Sinatra's Palm Springs estate and his Los Angeles properties, always in his orbit, always accessible when he wanted company, always waiting when he didn't. The staff began treating her less like a guest and more like a permanent fixture. She told herself she was recovering, healing, preparing for her next move, but in reality, she was becoming absorbed into Frank's world, losing the boundaries between his life and hers, trading the possibility of independence for the illusion of security. Living in Sinatra's orbit meant becoming familiar with the cast of characters who populated his world, and that cast included some of the most dangerous men in America. The Rat Pack were the public face of Sinatra's empire, but behind that glamorous facade was a darker network. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss, was a regular presence at Sinatra's gatherings. Johnny Rosselli, the mafia's man in Hollywood, came and went freely. These weren't social acquaintances. They were partners in various ventures, men with whom Sinatra shared interests in casinos, unions, and the hidden architecture of power. Marilyn, sitting by the pool or attending dinner parties, found herself surrounded by men who spoke in coded language, who stopped conversations when she entered the room, who treated her with a courtly respect that barely concealed their awareness of her as a beautiful object, rather than a person with agency. What Marilyn didn't know was that many of these gatherings were under FBI surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with the intersection of organized crime and entertainment meant that Sinatra's homes were frequent targets of observation. Bureau agents noted arrivals and departures, recorded license plates, documented meetings. Marilyn Monroe's presence made her a person of interest, and her conversations, phone calls, and movements were logged in files that would remain classified for decades. The FBI had been watching Marilyn since the 1950s, suspicious of her marriage to Arthur Miller and his left-wing associations, but her connection to Sinatra elevated that surveillance to a new level. Now she wasn't just a potential communist sympathizer, she was someone with access to mob figures, to politicians, to the secret handshakes that moved power in post-war America. And she had no idea that every moment of her supposed refuge was being documented, that her search for safety had placed her at the center of multiple investigations, that the sanctuary Sinatra offered was actually a fishbowl where every movement was visible to watchers she couldn't see. One of the most insidious aspects of Marilyn's time in Sinatra's world was the easy access to prescription medications. Frank had relationships with several discreet physicians who catered to Hollywood's elite, who understood that their wealthy clients needed certain substances to manage the pressures of fame, who were willing to write prescriptions without asking too many questions. For Marilyn, who had been struggling with barbiturate dependency since the mid-1950s, this ready access was both a relief and a trap. The pills that helped her sleep at night, the amphetamines that got her through the day, the tranquilizers that smoothed the rough edges of her anxiety, all were available through Sinatra's network, delivered discreetly, refilled without hassle. But the effect was to deepen her dependency, to create a situation where Marilyn's daily stability required constant pharmaceutical intervention controlled by and accessed through Frank's world. By mid-1961, Marilyn's pill consumption had increased dramatically. She was taking Nembutal to sleep, often washing down multiple capsules with champagne. She was using Dexedrine to wake up, to find the energy to face the day. She was supplementing with various tranquilizers to manage her anxiety during waking hours. The result was a woman who was never quite fully present, whose moods swung wildly depending on which chemicals were dominant in her system at any given moment, who had lost the ability to sleep naturally, or wake naturally, or feel naturally. The staff at Sinatra's homes grew accustomed to finding her unconscious in the afternoon, to hearing her pacing at 3 in the morning, to managing the logistics of a woman whose body and mind were at war. Sinatra, when present, would express concern but seemed to view the situation as manageable, just another eccentric behavior from another temperamental star. He didn't see that Marilyn was slowly disappearing into a pharmaceutical fog, that the woman he had invited into his home was being replaced by a chemically altered version who needed the pills more than she needed food or human connection. What made Marilyn's time in Sinatra's world particularly volatile was the political dimension. Frank Sinatra had been instrumental in John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign, organizing fundraisers, mobilizing celebrity support. After Kennedy's victory, Sinatra saw himself as a trusted insider, someone who had earned special access to the new president. He was planning to host Kennedy at his Palm Springs compound, had even built a special guest cottage for the presidential visit. Peter Lawford, married to Kennedy's sister Patricia, was part of the Rat Pack, creating a direct family connection. But this connection was increasingly problematic, because the FBI's surveillance of Sinatra's mob associations was creating political risks that the Kennedy administration couldn't ignore. Bobby Kennedy, the new Attorney General, was determined to prosecute organized crime, and his targets included many of the men who regularly appeared at Sinatra's gatherings. Into this complicated political landscape came Marilyn Monroe, living in Sinatra's homes, attending his parties, visible to everyone who moved through Frank's orbit. Some of those visitors were Kennedy's political allies. Some were the criminals Bobby Kennedy was trying to destroy. And Marilyn, with her history of relationships with powerful men and her reputation for indiscretion when medicated, represented a potential exposure risk. There were already whispers about Marilyn and JFK. They had met at various Hollywood gatherings, and rumors of a romantic connection were beginning to circulate. Sinatra, as the host and facilitator of these social worlds, was at the center of something that could explode at any moment. A president, a mob boss, and America's sex symbol all connected through his living room. The people who worked in Sinatra's homes saw a version of Marilyn Monroe that the public never witnessed. They saw her on bad days when the medication wasn't working, when she couldn't get out of bed, when she would wander the house at night unable to sleep. They saw the empty bottles accumulating in her bathroom, the meals barely touched, the phone calls that ended with her crying. They saw Sinatra's frustration when Marilyn's needs became inconvenient, when her presence required more attention than he was willing to give. And they saw something else too. The way Marilyn would transform when Sinatra returned from a trip, pulling herself together, applying makeup, creating a performance of wellness that covered the deterioration underneath. She was desperate to maintain Frank's approval, to justify his protection, to prove she wasn't as broken as she felt. One housekeeper who worked at the Palm Springs compound later recalled finding Marilyn unconscious by the pool one afternoon, an empty bottle of Nembutal beside her. The housekeeper called for help, and Marilyn was revived, but the incident was never reported, never documented, kept silent to protect both Marilyn's privacy and Sinatra's reputation. This wasn't an isolated event. There were multiple occasions when staff members had to intervene, had to make sure she was still breathing. But the culture in Sinatra's world was one of absolute discretion. Whatever happened behind those walls stayed behind those walls. Staff members signed non-disclosure agreements. Loyalty to Sinatra was absolute. Years later, when some of these staff members finally spoke to biographers, their accounts painted a devastating picture. A woman whose search for refuge had become a kind of slow-motion collapse, enabled and concealed by the very system that claimed to be protecting her. One of the most enduring mysteries is the nature of their intimate relationship. Were they lovers? Was this a romance? Or was it something more transactional, protection in exchange for companionship? The truth exists in a complicated gray area. There's no question that Sinatra was attracted to Marilyn, and that she, in her vulnerable state, was susceptible to the attentions of a powerful man who seemed to offer stability. Some biographers claim they had a brief affair, pointing to eyewitness accounts of physical intimacy. Other sources insist the relationship never became sexual, that Sinatra saw Marilyn more as a damaged sister figure needing protection. What seems most likely is that the relationship existed in that ambiguous space where intimacy, dependency, and power all intersected without ever being clearly defined. There were probably moments of physical connection, nights when loneliness and medication led to something romantic. But there was never a commitment, never an exclusive relationship, never the kind of stability that Marilyn actually needed. Sinatra was simultaneously involved with other women during this period, and he made no promises to Marilyn about the future. What he offered was protection without possession, intimacy without commitment. For Marilyn, who had spent her entire adult life confusing desire with love, this ambiguity was devastating. She was caught in a liminal space, neither fully independent nor fully committed, suspended in a relationship that met some of her needs while denying others. By early 1962, it was clear to almost everyone except Marilyn herself that the arrangement had become unsustainable. She had been living in his orbit for nearly a year, and instead of recovering, she had declined. Her medication dependency had worsened. Her career was stalled. She hadn't completed a film since The Misfits, and the industry was beginning to write her off. Her mental health had deteriorated under the isolation and instability, and Sinatra himself was growing tired of the arrangement. What had started as a gallant gesture had become a burden. Marilyn's needs were increasing while his patience was decreasing. He had his own life to live, his own career to manage, his own romantic interests to pursue. The breaking point came gradually. Sinatra became less available, less attentive, more likely to leave Marilyn alone for extended periods. When they were together, his frustration was more visible. He began suggesting that Marilyn needed to get her own place, to start working again, to rebuild her independent life. But Marilyn, so fragile and dependent, couldn't imagine how to make that transition. Where would she go? How would she manage the medications without Sinatra's doctors? Who would protect her from the press, from the industry demands, from her own demons? The refuge that was supposed to be temporary had become the only thing keeping her from complete collapse, and the man who had offered that refuge was ready for her to leave. Marilyn Monroe finally left Frank Sinatra's orbit in the spring of 1962, purchasing a small house in Brentwood and attempting to rebuild some version of an independent life. But the damage from those hidden months was profound and irreversible. She had lost nearly a year of career momentum, had deepened her medication dependency to levels that made normal functioning nearly impossible, and had learned once again that powerful men who promised protection often delivered something far more complicated and far more costly. The pattern that had defined her relationship with Sinatra, initial safety followed by gradual control, generosity that came with invisible strings, protection that required submission, would repeat in her final months with the Kennedy brothers, creating a dynamic that many believe contributed to her death on August 4, 1962, just 16 months after she first arrived at Sinatra's door, seeking refuge. Frank Sinatra rarely spoke publicly about Marilyn's time in his homes, maintaining the party line that he had simply helped a friend through a difficult period. The FBI files documenting Marilyn's movements through Sinatra's world remained classified for decades, finally released through Freedom of Information Act requests that revealed the extent to which her search for privacy had actually placed her under unprecedented government surveillance. What emerges from the fragments of evidence that have survived is a devastating portrait of a woman who sought safety and found only another version of the gilded cage that had defined her entire life, a refuge that was never quite refuge, a protection that was never quite protection, a friendship that was never quite friendship. The story reveals something profound about the nature of fame, power, and vulnerability in mid-century America. Here was the most famous woman in the world, desired by millions, and yet so fundamentally alone that she had to trade her autonomy for the illusion of safety. And here was Hollywood itself, that dream factory that created gods and goddesses for public consumption, revealing its essential cruelty, the understanding that stars were valuable only as long as they could perform, that vulnerability was a liability, that the machinery of fame had no room for actual human fragility. Marilyn Monroe walked into Frank Sinatra's compound in March 1961, hoping to find shelter from the storm. What she found instead was the eye of a hurricane, a temporary calm that concealed the chaos waiting to consume her. And when she finally stepped back out, just 16 months before her death, she carried with her all the damage of those hidden months, damage that would prove impossible to heal.